Hey, how's it going everyone? It's Lee Halliday, and today we are going to learn about generics in TypeScript. And I won't even try to explain what they are right now. I'm just going to show how they work, and then from that explanation, you'll get an idea of sort of what they're used for and what they are, and etc. So the code we're looking at today, we're working in Next.js. That's not so important. It's just really easy to get set up with TypeScript, so I chose it. And what we've got is this component, this home component, that if we were to look on the page, it's an input that saves its content and renders it out in the input. But the one thing that it does is it doesn't use the use state hook. It uses a custom hook that I created up here called use local state, where you pass in not only the initial value, which is an empty string, but a key. And what it does is whenever that value changes, it writes to local storage. And whenever you refresh the page and it initializes the state, it will first check to see if there's a value left over in local storage that it can use instead. So on this page here, if I refresh, like I'm doing, you can see that it still keeps generics. So that's what we're working with. And it's in TypeScript, and everything's happy. There's no TypeScript errors. But TypeScript's, I guess, serving very little purpose right now, because if I were to hover, we can see text is type of any. The set text function is type of any. So it's giving us very little value right now because everything is any. So what I'm going to do is switch over to my tsconfig, and I'm going to swap this from strict false to true. And as soon as you do that, you're going to see that I start to get some errors, because when you're in strict mode, it wants you to define explicitly what the types are anytime you're using. You can't have any implicit any's like it was before. So this function, use local state, it takes in the key input and the initial value. It calls the use state hook that comes from React, and it does that little bit about checking to see if it's in local storage, and if so, using it. That part's not so important right now. I have a whole nother video on the ins and outs in this. What's important is that we need to provide types for these two arguments being passed, or parameters being passed to this function. So key is easy. It's a string. It's always a string. That's what local storage wants. As its keys, it wants strings. This initial is where it gets tricky, because right now we can see we're using a string, but you don't always have to store strings in state. You can use anything in state. You can have objects, booleans, numbers, etc. So because we don't know how it's going to be used, we can't really say that this is also going to be a string, because it's not. Depending who uses it, it could be something different. And because we don't know, we have to say any. And that fixes TypeScript again, because we've explicitly told it it's any. And we can go a little farther and we can say type YOLO is equal to any. So we can live on the wild side and say, okay, initial is YOLO, anything you want, you only live once. So we're still getting very little value out of TypeScript at this point. But because we don't know what type of data the user is going to pass to us, there's no real way to handle this in TypeScript, and this is where generics come into play. Generics, in their simplest terms, are basically a way for the user who's calling the function to give us a hint or to tell us what types it's going to be passing in. So you might have used, if you've used like use query or use mutation with Apollo, little angly brackets here when you call it. And you may have even seen that with use state. And here's where you can pass in the type. So we're going to pass in basically the type that we're passing as this second argument here. And we're going to tell the function that, hey, we're going to be passing you a string. But this function's not set up to receive any of these type hints or type arguments yet. Here you can see expected 0 type arguments, but it got 1. So the way we handle that is we come up here and we add some angly brackets at this point in the function definition. And what you're going to see common is people tend to use like 1 character letters to define sort of a variable to put this type in. So you might see T or S, since it's the type of the state being passed in. It can be anything. Like you can call it anything you want. It's just common to call it 1 character for some reason. So whenever you're reading code and you're like, S, what's S? How does it know what S is? That's basically the first one being passed in as the type int here. Now you could have more, in which case you would need something else here because it's receiving 2 type arguments, but we're just going to work with 1 right now. So now that we have this S up here and the calling code is telling us it's a string, it's time to use this. So what we can do is we can come in and we can replace YOLO with S, meaning whatever type hint is passed to our function, our type parameter, we're going to initial takes on that type that was hinted at down here. And essentially this is generics. Our function receives generic types as specified by the user. And then we can use that within the rest of our function here. Unfortunately, you can see it's still telling us any. So we have to do a little bit more work. So we can go in to use state, which also takes a type parameter. And we can pass along the S here. And now, see, getting back, it knows it's going to get back S and then a dispatch function that receives S. So let's go down here and you can see it's starting to improve. Now it knows that text is either a string or a dispatch function, and set text is also the same thing. So that's not perfectly useful yet because it's saying these could be one or the other and we're not quite sure. And you can see here we're actually getting a type error down below because it's saying value is expecting a string, but you're giving it this thing that could be a string or a dispatch function, which is not useful. Same with set text. You can't call a string. It's not a function. So what we need to do is basically on this return type provide a little bit more information to the value going back. So what we can do here is basically just say whatever's being returned, it's going to be returned as, and then just give it a little bit of a hint of what it is. So we could say that value is S and set value is dispatch, basically this big thing like this, but it can't find dispatch or set state action, so we would have to import it from React up here, and that's a little bit of a pain. So there's an easier way of dealing with this scenario, and what we can do is use the type of, and you often see that used in JavaScript itself. Check if the type of window, if it's not equals undefined, that means we're in the browser, not on the server. You can use type of as well in TypeScript. So you can say this value, it's going to be type of value, and set value, which is a dispatch, is going to be a type of set value, like this. So what we're returning is a tuple, meaning in this case, or is a tuple always 2? Anyways, it's an array with always 2 values. There's never going to be 3 or 1. It's always 2. Hence, I think the word tuple. So what we're getting back here is if we hover the first element in our tuple is a string, and now the second one is always a dispatch, a set state function that's going to receive a string. And that clears up this code here because it knows that text is going to be a string. And over here, it knows that set text is going to be a dispatch. So I wanted to go a little bit further and talk about how you can limit what sorts of types your function can receive. Because right now, we can essentially pass anything. So we could come down here and say, hey, we're going to give you anything. And now we're back to any. We could pass a number in. So now it's thinking that text is going to be a number. And it is giving us an error because it's saying string is not assignable to type number, and this is failing as well. But what if we wanted to allow sort of a limited set of types? What we can do is come up here to the type parameter definition, and we can say that it extends, and then we can define a type or multiple types that it extends from. And by default, it's essentially doing any. Basically, S is a subset or a child of the any type, which is anything. What we can do instead is limit that a little bit more, and we could say we're going to allow for a string or a number, basically a union of these two types. So now if we were to pass in number, this won't be happy, and this isn't happy because we're passing in a string, but it would be okay. We could say that we're going to pass in a string or a number, and now it's happy again. But if we were to ever say we're passing in a Boolean, now it's freaking out because Boolean does not satisfy string or number. So what we could do is we could say we're going to pass in string or null. Maybe we update this to allow for null. So now that's happy. We could pass in null as our initial value. Now this value isn't happy because you can't pass null to a value, so you'd have to sort of do nullish coalescing to say use text, or if it's nullish, use this empty string. That makes it happy again. But basically this is a way you can limit the types that are passed in to this function. You can also give it a default. So basically, like if you're provided nothing, assume it's a string. So you can say that it's equal to a string. And I think you can even say it extends string or number, but the default is a string. So you can get sort of as crazy as you want, limiting the types and setting the defaults being passed in as your generic or your type parameter. But in this case, use local state. Use local state can really be used for anything that can be stringified into JSON and stored into local storage. So this is good. I can even delete this YOLO here because I'm not using that anymore. And now we're fully typed. So when we call this use local state, we're saying we're going to be either string or null. And so then our value back here is string or null. This dispatch takes string or null. And we just need to coalesce into a string to make the input tag happy, because that's what it wants to receive. So that was an intro to generics, a way for the user who's calling your function to provide type hints by passing type parameters, and then how you can use them in your code so that in your function it sort of knows what types it's dealing with. Hope you enjoyed the video. Take care. Have a nice day. Bye.